I need to tell you something before I begin. I am not someone who believes in revenge. I was raised to forgive. To be gracious. To take the high road even when the road was steep and the people pushing you off it were smiling while they did it. I believed in those things for 61 years. And then my husband died on a Tuesday in November, and by Thursday his daughter had changed the locks on my front door. The front door of the house I had lived in for 22 years. The house where I had painted every room, planted every flower, and sat with my husband every Sunday morning drinking coffee and reading the newspaper in a silence so comfortable it felt like its own kind of love. That door. And I want to tell you what happened next. Because what happened next is the reason I am sitting here today. In a house that is twice the size. With a document in a safe deposit box that I think about every single morning when I wake up. Chapter 1, The Beginning. My name is Margaret. I met Robert when I was 38 years old. I had been married before. Briefly. A mistake I made when I was 24 and believed that love was enough to build a life on without also needing compatibility, shared values, and the basic ability to have a conversation without one of you walking out of the room. It was not enough. We divorced after 3 years. No children. No bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that we had been wrong about each other. Robert had also been married before. His first wife, Caroline, had died of cancer when their daughter Diane was 11 years old. I knew this before our first date. Robert told me on the phone, the way he told me everything, directly, without drama, as if the facts of his life were simply facts and not performances. I respected that immediately. We met through mutual friends at a dinner party I almost did not attend. I had been tired that evening. I had been tired for several years, actually, tired of being alone, tired of pretending I was not tired of it, tired of the particular exhaustion that comes from doing everything by yourself and making it look effortless because you have no one to be tired in front of. But I went. And Robert was sitting at the end of the table, talking to no one in particular, looking at his wine glass with the expression of a man who was also only there because someone had insisted. We spent the entire dinner talking to each other and no one else. By the end of the night I knew 3 things. He was kind. He was honest. And he was going to be important to me. I was right about all 3. We married 2 years later. Diane was 13. I want to be careful about how I describe what followed, because I am aware that I am telling this story and Diane is not here to tell hers. What I can tell you is what I experienced. And what I experienced was a child who had lost her mother at 11 years old and had decided, at some point in the years between that loss and my arrival, that no one was going to be allowed to replace her. I understood that. Completely. I never tried to be her mother. I told her that explicitly, more than once. I said, I am not here to replace anyone. I am here because I love your father and I hope that someday we can be something to each other, even if that something is just 2 people who care about the same man and can sit in the same room without it being difficult. She heard me say that. Whether she believed me is a different question. The years that followed were not terrible. I want to be honest about that too. There were birthdays and holidays and graduations. There were moments of warmth that I chose to hold on to because the alternative was too discouraging. But there was always something underneath. A current. A resistance that never fully disappeared no matter what I did or did not do. Robert saw it. He worried about it. He talked to Diane about it more times than I know, because he was careful to have those conversations privately, which I respected. What I did not fully understand until much later was how deep that resistance went. And what Diane was capable of when she felt the time was right. Chapter 2, The Betrayal. Robert was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease when he was 67. It came slowly at first, the way these things do, a tremor in his left hand that he mentioned almost apologetically one evening, as if he were reporting a minor inconvenience rather than the beginning of the longest ending I have ever witnessed. Over the next 4 years, I watched my husband become someone who needed help with buttons. Then someone who needed help with stairs. Then someone who needed help with everything. I gave him that help. Not because I had to. Not because there was no other option. Because he was my husband and I loved him, and that is what love looks like when it is real and it is tested and it holds. Diane visited during these years. Not as often as I would have liked, though I never said this aloud. She lived 3 hours away and had her own life, and I understood that. What I noticed, and tried not to read too much into, was that her visits had a quality to them that I can only describe as observational. She would walk through the house slowly. She would ask Robert questions about finances, about the property, about the future, in a tone that was concerned but somehow also inventorying. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself she was a daughter worried about her father, and that was all. Robert died on a November Tuesday. He was in the hospital. I was holding his hand. Diane was in the waiting room. She had arrived 2 days earlier, and we had spent those days in a careful, exhausted politeness that I think both of us knew was only possible because we were both focused entirely on him. When he died, I held his hand for a long time. Then I walked out to the waiting room and I told Diane. She cried. I cried. We held each other for a moment in the strange way of two people who are not close but are sharing the largest possible thing. And then we went our separate ways in that corridor, and I did not understand yet that we were also going our separate ways in every other sense. The funeral was a week later. 80 people came. Robert had been loved in the quiet way of people who are consistently kind over many decades, not dramatic about it, not performing it, just reliably, persistently, genuinely decent to everyone they encountered. I stood at the front and accepted condolences for 4 hours. Diane stood beside me for the first hour and then moved away, which I noticed but did not comment on. 3 days after the funeral, a lawyer called. He said his name was Gerald Marsh and he represented Robert's estate, and he needed to schedule a meeting with Diane and me to discuss the will. I said of course. I had no reason not to. Robert and I had made our wills together 8 years earlier. A straightforward arrangement. The house would go to me. Our joint savings would go to me. Robert's personal accounts and investments would be split equally between me and Diane. That was what we had decided together. That was what we had both signed. I knew this because I had been there. The meeting was on a Friday morning. I arrived at Gerald Marsh's office and found Diane already seated. She did not look at me when I came in. I sat down. Gerald Marsh was a small man with careful eyes who placed a folder on the desk between us and opened it with the particular deliberateness of someone who has delivered difficult news before and has learned to slow down to give people time to understand what they are hearing. He said, "I want to walk you through the contents of Robert's will." He began reading. The house. To Diane. The joint savings account. To Diane. Robert's personal investments. To Diane. A sum of $40,000. To Margaret. I sat very still. I heard the words. I processed them one at a time, the way you process words when they do not match anything you understand about reality. And then I said, quietly, "That is not our will." Gerald Marsh looked at me with those careful eyes. He said, "This is the most recent version, signed 14 months ago." 14 months ago Robert's tremor had been significant. His handwriting had been affected. His ability to sit at a desk and sign documents had required assistance. I said, "I would like to see the signature." Gerald Marsh turned the document toward me. The signature was Robert's. Or it was close enough to Robert's that I could not immediately say with certainty that it was not. But something was wrong. I did not know what yet. I just knew that the man who had sat with me every Sunday morning for 22 years and told me everything, every worry, every hope, every small frustration of his day, had not told me he was changing his will. And that Robert, who was the most transparent person I had ever known, would not have done that. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen. 2 hours later, a locksmith's van pulled up outside. Diane had called ahead. Chapter 3: The Decision. I stood on the pavement outside my house with a single suitcase. I had packed it quickly, in the 40 minutes between when the locksmith left and when I understood that I was not going to be allowed back inside. Diane stood in the doorway. She said, "I think it would be better for both of us if you found somewhere else to stay while everything is settled." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about 22 years. I thought about paint colors and flower beds and Sunday mornings and the way Robert had reached for my hand without thinking about it, the way you reach for something that has simply become part of how you exist in the world. I thought about all of it. And then I said, "All right." Not because I accepted it. Not because I believed she had the right to do what she was doing. But because I had learned something in 61 years that I want to share with you right now. The moment when everything has been taken from you is the worst possible moment to speak. The anger is too loud. The grief is too fresh. The words that come in that moment are the words that can be used against you, twisted, quoted back in rooms you are not in, shaped into a version of you that you will spend years trying to correct. So I said, "All right." I picked up my suitcase. And I went to stay with my sister Carol, who lived 40 minutes away and who, when I arrived at her door and she saw my face, said nothing at all and simply stepped aside to let me in. I slept for 14 hours. And when I woke up, I started thinking. Not feeling. Thinking. Because there was something wrong with that will and I needed to understand what it was before I did anything else. I called Gerald Marsh the following Monday and requested a copy of the complete document. He was legally obligated to provide it. He did. I read it 4 times. And on the 4th reading I found what had been bothering me. A clause. A specific clause regarding the house that referenced a property assessment conducted in the previous calendar year. The assessment was cited by number. I had never seen that assessment. Had never been asked about it. Had never been told it was happening. Robert had been ill for 4 years. In the last 14 months his cognitive function had begun to show effects of the disease. Not severe, he had still been himself, still known me, still been capable of conversation and even of humor. But capable of independently initiating a property assessment and arranging a meeting with a lawyer to rewrite his will? Without mentioning it to me once? I did not believe it. I called a lawyer of my own. Her name was Patricia Chen and she had been recommended to me by Carol's husband who was a retired judge and who, when Carol told him what had happened, had said one word. Fight. Patricia Chen met with me for 2 hours. She listened to everything. At the end she said, "What you're describing raises serious questions about testamentary capacity and potential undue influence." She said, "I need you to find everything. Medical records from the last 2 years. Any communications between Robert and Diane about finances. Any evidence of who initiated contact with Gerald Marsh's office." She said, "And I need you to think carefully. Is there anything Robert said to you in the last year of his life that seemed unusual? Anything he mentioned and then did not follow up on? Anything that, in retrospect, felt like he was trying to tell you something?" I sat with that question for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, I remembered. Chapter 4: The Evidence. 6 months before he died, Robert had a good week. There are good weeks and bad weeks with Parkinson's, and this had been one of the good ones. He was clearer, steadier, more himself than he had been in months. One evening during that week he had asked me to sit with him in what we called the study, The small room at the back of the house where he kept his books and his desk, and a photograph of his parents on their wedding day. He had been quiet for a long time. And then he said, "There's something I should have told you sooner." I had assumed he meant something personal. A feeling. A worry about his health or about what was coming. I said, "You can tell me anything." He said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you that if anything ever seems wrong, if anything ever doesn't make sense, look in the book." I said, "Which book?" He smiled. He said, "You'll know." And then one of his nurses had knocked to give him his evening medication, and the moment had passed, and I had filed it away in the way you file away things that don't fully make sense yet, thinking there will be time, there is always time, we will come back to this. We did not come back to it. He died 6 months later, and I had forgotten that conversation entirely until Patricia Chen asked me if there was anything unusual, and I sat alone in Carol's spare bedroom for 3 days and let my mind go back over every moment of the last year. And I remembered the study. And the book. I called Diane. I told her I needed to collect some personal items from the house, and I would like to do it while she was present, so there was no question of anything being taken that she had not agreed to. She said I could come on Saturday. I arrived at 10 in the morning. Diane followed me from room to room, which I had expected. I took my time. I went through the study last. The bookshelves covered the entire back wall. Robert had been a reader his entire life: history, biography, the occasional novel, books about architecture and mathematics and the natural world. I stood in front of those shelves and I thought, "You'll know." I knew his shelves. I had dusted them for 22 years. I had bought him books for birthdays and Christmases. I knew which authors he returned to and which ones he had read once and kept only out of a sense of completion. And I knew which book was in the wrong place. It was a biography of Abraham Lincoln that Robert had read so many times the spine was cracked. It had always lived on the 3rd shelf, second from the left. It was on the 5th shelf. Far right. I took it down. Diane was watching me. I said, "This one. I gave him this one for his birthday years ago. I'd like to keep it." She shrugged. Said fine. I put it in my bag. I took it back to Carol's house. I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened it. Between pages 180 and 181 there was an envelope. Inside the envelope were 4 things. The first was a handwritten letter from Robert. 2 pages. Dated 13 months ago, 1 month before the date on the revised will. The second was a photograph. Diane and Gerald Marsh, the lawyer, standing together outside what appeared to be a restaurant. They were smiling. The photograph had a date stamp in the corner. They had known each other before Robert died. Before any will was changed. Before any meeting in any office. The third item was a copy of a document I had never seen, a power of attorney form, granting Diane authority over Robert's financial affairs, signed during a period when Robert's medical records would later show he had been on a medication that significantly affected his cognitive function. The fourth item was a single handwritten line at the bottom of a separate piece of paper. It said, "I'm sorry I didn't do this sooner. The real will is with Thomas. He knows what to do." Thomas was Robert's brother, who lived in another state, who I had not spoken to since the funeral, who, when I called him that evening and explained what I had found, was quiet for a very long moment. And then said, "Thank God." He said, "Robert sent me something 3 months before he died. He made me promise to keep it until it was needed." He said, "I think it's needed." Chapter 5, The Justice. What Thomas had was a second will. Handwritten. Witnessed by 2 of Robert's oldest friends, men who had known him for 40 years and who were, when Patricia Chen contacted them, immediately willing to testify. dated 4 months before Robert died, during one of his good periods. It was not a complicated document. It left the house to me. It left our joint savings to me. It divided Robert's personal investments equally between me and Diane. Exactly as we had originally planned. Exactly as we had agreed together 8 years earlier. And it contained a note in Robert's handwriting. It said, "I know what has been done. I was not able to stop it while I was alive without causing a conflict that would have broken something I didn't want broken. But I could not leave without making sure Margaret was protected. She has been the best thing in my life for 22 years. She deserves the truth and she deserves what we built together." Patricia Chin filed the contest within the week. The process that followed took 11 months. I will not walk you through all of it because some of it was genuinely painful and I am not interested in performing my pain for anyone. What I will tell you is the shape of it. Gerald Marsh's connection to Diane was investigated. They had, it emerged, known each other for 3 years before Robert's death. She had referred clients to him. He had, in return, been available to her in ways that a lawyer should not be available to the family of a client. The power of attorney was examined by medical experts who reviewed Robert's records from the period it was signed. 2 separate neurologists concluded independently that Robert's cognitive function during that period, combined with the medication he was on, made it unlikely he had fully understood what he was signing. The photograph of Diane and Gerald Marsh, combined with their financial relationship and the timeline of when they had first made contact with each other, told a story that the court found compelling. The handwritten will, witnessed by 2 credible men who had no financial interest in the outcome, was found to be valid. The revised will was set aside. I went home. Not immediately. There were papers to sign and dates to schedule and a period of transition that I will not pretend was not uncomfortable. But I went home. I walked through those rooms again for the first time in 11 months. I stood in the kitchen where I had made coffee every morning for 22 years. I walked through the study and stood in front of the bookshelves. The Lincoln biography was back on the 3rd shelf, second from the left, where it had always been. I sat down in Robert's chair and I stayed there for a very long time. Diane did not contest the final ruling. Her attorney advised her not to. I do not know what her life looks like now. I have not tried to find out. What I know is that the document in my safe deposit box, the one I think about every morning, is a copy of the handwritten letter Robert wrote 13 months before he died. Not because I need it anymore, but because it is the last thing he wrote for me, and I am not ready to stop keeping it somewhere safe. He wrote, "I have always trusted you to be stronger than I was in the moments that required it. This is one of those moments. I'm sorry it has to be." He was right. And I was. I want to say one thing to anyone who is listening to this and who is in the middle of something that feels unsurvivable. When everything has been taken from you, the instinct is to react immediately. To scream. To fight loudly and publicly and with all the anger that is completely justified and completely real. But the moment when everything has been taken is the worst moment to speak. Wait. Look for what was left for you. Because the people who love us, the ones who truly love us, they know us well enough to leave us what we need. Even when they are no longer there to hand it to us themselves. Thank you for listening. If this story reached you at the right moment, please subscribe. New story every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if someone needs to hear this today, send it to them. I will see you in the next one.